Hello, everybody, and welcome to this month's edition of the Seekers Forum. I'm glad to be back with you. Today, we're going to be talking about stubbornness as a source of spiritual power and the part that obstinacy plays in the commitment to living an intentional, deliberate, and conscious life. Now, stubbornness is one of those misunderstood qualities that frequently gets a bad rep in consciousness circles, because we tend to equate stubbornness with being pig-headed and inflexible, even boorish, rough, insensitive, and out of touch. The stubborn person, we think, is rigid, narrow, and implicitly self-centered, unable to change their mind or entertain alternative views. To be stubborn is to be closed and narrow, opposed to spirituality, which is open, expansive, and we imagine detached. This is what I call the soft view of spirituality, an ideal in which gentleness and acceptance are everything. And things like obstinacy and the refusal to deviate from personal choice are often misconstrued as the antithesis of wisdom. Now, this soft view of spirituality has its place, of course. We want to be sensitive and responsive and willing to entertain new ideas. Stubbornness in the form of self-absorption and narcissistic tunnel vision, though, are what are creating so many problems in the world today. But an entirely different set of problems is created when we abandon stubbornness in holding to what we know to be true. Most of us do this all too often for a wide variety of reasons that are frequently positive. Wanting to spare other people's feelings, to be a team player, to be in the moment, quote unquote, and not a prisoner of preconceived beliefs or plans. But whatever our motive, when we abandon what we know to be true in the name of camaraderie or propriety or special interest, we betray our own authenticity. We shrink to fit. We nip and tuck and edit and censor and limit ourselves with the belief that standing alone is a selfish thing to do, that refusing to budge from our chosen position is a sign of unenlightenment. Deceived in this way, we become reflections of other people's desires, and we risk living secondhand lives. We give up what's particular, unique, and original about ourselves for the sake of belonging, actually the illusion of belonging, and wonder why we spend our lives feeling so partial, fragmented, and fraudulent. When we refuse to stand on our own 2 feet, to be self-reliant, the muscle of conviction to be ourselves can often atrophy in the face of majority rule, in the name of being part of the crowd. It's no surprise that belonging has become such a byword of our times, with so many people complaining about not belonging, not having a place among others. It's true that in our hyperactive, virtual, global age, it can be harder to create community. And social connection matters deeply, of course. But the deeper reason that people don't feel that they belong anywhere is that they don't belong with and to themselves. They haven't found their own center. They're wobbly and looking for others to prop them up, to tell them who they are, to think for them, make their decisions, and relieve them of being individuals. Because we fear our own autonomy. It's easier to say it's a group decision or it's out of my hands than it is to step apart and disagree and risk being thrown out of the group. This human inclination toward sociability and group intelligence and not wanting to be an outsider, while it helped us to survive as a species, also has a deep, dangerous shadow that contains self-betrayal, self-avoidance, and difficulty with sticking to our own convictions. And this is where stubbornness comes in. Stubbornness is the glue that keeps us attached to what is true for us. The Italians have a great word for it. They call it grinta, Grinta, which has a much more positive connotation. Grinta is defined as fighting spirit or grit or gumption. It's the thing that keeps a rider upright in the saddle of a bucking horse. Grinta is stick-to-itness. It's adherence to integrity. It's a certain kind of toughness and resolve. It's a no in the face of dominating forces. If you've ever read Herman Melville's story, Bartleby the Scrivener, you may remember how Bartleby, this lowly law clerk, is asked to do something that he doesn't want to do and responds simply by saying, "I would prefer not to." Each time he's asked the same question in the story, he simply repeats, "I would prefer not to." Now, Bartleby the Scrivener had grinta. That's that quality of stubbornness, that refusal to give up what is his or to move in a direction that isn't true for him. And so do most other heroes, both major and minor, from the Buddha and Jesus Christ to Lincoln, to FDR, to Thich Nhat Hanh, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks. All of these people are embodiments of human obstinacy at its most constructive. This quality of spiritual stubbornness always exists alongside tenderness and a determination for justice and the relief of suffering, as opposed to selfish stubbornness, which is all about protecting our own interests. Spiritual stubbornness is never cruel, it's never punitive. Instead, it incorporates loving kindness and the innate desire to bring truth and light into the world. And that brings us to the central point, which is that spiritual stubbornness, just like authentic strength, always contains fragility. Recognizing our individual smallness, our vulnerability, the human spirit asserts itself with proportionate power in the form of refusal to be quashed into nothing. The spirit refuses to give up its voice. It will have its truth. It insists upon standing on its own 2 feet, even when the ground gets shaky. Such stubbornness is akin to what the psychologist and the Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl described as the last of the human freedoms. The last of the human freedoms, as Frankl described it, is the ability to choose our own way in any given set of circumstances. While we may be powerless over final outcomes, we're almost always able to choose how we respond to circumstances. And it's in this moment of choice, of obstinacy against conformity or fear, that we declare ourselves as fully human beings and we marshal our inherent courage. Just think about Greta Thunberg, the Swedish teenager who's become the icon of the environmental movement. Thunberg is like the Joan of Arc of global warming, though I hope she doesn't come to such an end. She arrived last week in New York from Europe on a solar-powered boat after refusing to fly because the carbon emissions from jet travel are contrary to what she's trying to mirror in the world. Even though she's frightened of the open sea, she explained that unless she holds firm to her own conviction and walks the talk, as she explained to one journalist, her message is going to be compromised and affect the global movement that she's spearheading. She looks like Heidi with her braids and her dimples, but Greta is stubbornness personified. She's undeterred in her mission. Nothing sways her because the stakes are too high. She simply doesn't allow her fears, doubts, and extreme shyness to stop her from doing the work that she needs to do in the public spotlight. Instead of allowing her mild autism to block her way, Greta uses it to her advantage by, quote, ignoring social cues, as she puts it, and taking her own path, trusting her own inner prompting. She's an embodiment of self-reliance, in fact. And she recalls why Emerson insisted that, quote, to be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you into someone else is the greatest accomplishment. That is our great challenge, to remain ourselves in a world that's constantly trying to make us into something else. And that's why this stubbornness matters so much. Each of us is called on to remain true to ourselves, despite the barrage of daily pressures to sell ourselves out. This requires a willingness to say no and to risk the opprobrium of those who disagree with us. Also, we need to transcend the shame and the low self-esteem that sometimes cause us to abandon ourselves in what we know to be true and best. Now, naturally, there are times to compromise and to conform, times to surrender and agree to majority rule. But when it comes to our own evolution and the choices that reflect or oppose our deepest convictions, compromise can be a very slippery slope. I know an extraordinarily stubborn man who's a good example of this evolution. The quality of stubbornness that enables him to do epic amounts of good work in the world and hold to his own eccentric vision as an artist and disobey civilly and sometimes uncivilly first appeared in his life as a gigantic no against abuses that were suffered in childhood. Rather than be crushed by adversity, he became a rebel, and he saved his own life as an artist, as an activist, by knowing how to say no. Until he learned to modulate his stubbornness with compassion and self awareness, however, this quality of refusal nearly killed him on several occasions and lost him many friends and supporters because he could be completely impossible and myopic when it came to his own blind spots and his refusal to see other people's perspectives. But as he got older and life had her way with him, as he got his heart broken and finally saw how his selfish stubbornness had been his Achilles heel and prevented him from learning and growing, he was able to adjust his understanding and now works very hard to be more open minded. He understood his own stubbornness to be the backbone of his character, but before he did any work on himself, that backbone was faulty and bent and in need of spiritual chiropractic. He didn't waste a lot of time blaming or regretting his particular backbone because he knew that it was the source of his conviction and his strength as well. But instead, he got limber. He worked out his own kinks, and he finally learned to balance obstinacy with kindness. So ask yourself, how does stubbornness affect your life for better or worse? Are you stubborn in helpful or harmful ways? Do you cave in too easily to other people's wishes and opinions? Do you value the integrity of your own deep knowing, or do you doubt that your inner wisdom is trustworthy? Are you able to admit when you're wrong and change positions when new insight dawns? And can you stand up for what's right? Can you speak truth to power? Can you walk your own path and stand by your own sovereignty? These are critical questions to ask ourselves as individuals drawn to spiritual awakening. While it's counterproductive to be ruled by unconscious stubbornness, stubbornness is based on ego protection and defensiveness. Conscious stubbornness in the name of positive evolution is absolutely essential. We need to remember that it's much harder in the material world to create and conserve than it is to destroy, which is why extra effort is needed to preserve the noble and the good. There's a saying in English that I'll paraphrase that says something like it takes 12 strong men to build a barn and one jackass to knock it down. A stubborn refusal not to give up, not to cave to the odds, not to stop fighting the good fight in whatever way we can is what gives our lives meaning. Though we may wish for growth and illumination to be given to us without having to work or hurt for them, it's precisely the struggle against adversity that fortifies and defines our character. Rather than wish for things to be easier than they are, we come to understand that those things that force us to push, to dig deep, to work against the grain and break new ground, both within ourselves and outside, are actually our greatest teachers. So here are a few areas where stubbornness is especially useful. You may have heard of the 4 agreements. You might call these the 8 refusals. Let's start with the refusal to be duped by illusion. The refusal to be duped by illusion, including the illusion of ego, is the first step toward taking our own side, keeping our own seat in the long process of awakening. Spiritual aspiration boils down to a concerted desire to live in truth, starting with the truth of who we are beyond the self-image that we carry in our heads and the stories that we tell ourselves in order to sustain an illusion of separateness. The refusal to believe the myths we live by and question the nature of identity is absolutely essential if we hope to wake up from the egoic trance and tap into the source of our being. This only happens when we challenge our faulty beliefs and admit how little we actually know. This admission, this uncertainty, is actually the beginning of wisdom. So that's the first refusal, the refusal to be duped by illusion. The next refusal is the refusal to belittle our own true nature. While you and I may be divine creations of a great intelligence, so vast and miraculous that we can't begin to fathom its nature and scope, we tend to reduce ourselves to the lowest common denominator in an effort to fit in with the rest of the crowd. We resist stepping into the power of what we are and the breadth of our own possibilities. We prefer to play small and color inside the lines, to diminish self-awareness and miss opportunities to grow beyond what we already know. When we refuse to overlook our potential, however, this story of self-diminishment ends. We automatically gravitate toward wisdom, compassion, and truth. And that brings us to our third step, the refusal to accept the status quo. I'm talking about the Western view that we are essentially material beings whose brains are the alpha and omega of cosmic intelligence. When we worship the brain as the be-all and end-all of existence, we miss the lion's share of what's true and beautiful about the world. We forget about the body's intelligence. We forget about natural law. We overlook transcendental awareness and the spiritual source of creativity. We forget that love and altruism, surrender, faith, prayer, invention, synchronicity, and the universal rhythm that is moving us. All of these are forgotten when we insist upon the status quo, that we are our brains first and foremost. A stubborn refusal to go along with this materialist propaganda goes a very long way toward helping us maintain an enlightened view in the midst of worldly confusion. Now, the fourth refusal is a refusal to succumb to cynicism. Cynicism is epidemic, particularly in Western culture. Cynicism is a result of believing that we are brains with bodies. Looking at the world through the eyes of reason, it's easy to become judgmental and focus on what's missing, not on what's present. Just as it's easier to destroy than to build, it's easier to be cynical than it is to be inspired or hopeful. Hope requires that we risk disappointment and keep trying in the face of difficult odds. The cynic says, why bother? But the spiritual refusenik says, how can I not bother, knowing how intolerable life is without the prospect of healing and awakening? The seeker would much rather fail and keep trying, knowing that there's satisfaction in the effort itself, than sink into the necrophilic arms of despair and give up on ourselves and the world. At its core, this is a choice not to hate or do harm, which is the fifth on our list of refusals, not to hate or do harm. Deciding to make harmlessness the bottom line of our ethical code, we reorient ourselves toward honor, toward preservation, and toward dynamism, toward what in Jewish tradition is called tikkun olam, the repair of the world. This new orientation affects the choices that we make, the reactions that we allow, the goals that we set, and the intentions that we use to strengthen our own resolve. We ask ourselves, are we harming or helping? Are we raising the vibration or are we lowering it? These are the questions that we ask ourselves every day, case by case, as we resist the urge to go unconscious or simply stop caring altogether. Our next refusal is the refusal to be dictated to by others, to take others' beliefs as our own, or swallow received ideas without first tasting them and seeing if they're actually digestible to us. When we challenge people to become our own authorities and make our own choices, though, it's quite a tall order because the vast majority of individuals in every culture prefer to be spoon fed their convictions rather than think for themselves. We tend to fear, as a rule, making our own decisions, since most people harbor grave doubts about their own knowledge and ability. We tend to reject our own ideas quite simply because they are our own. When we refuse to be dictated to by others, though, we learn to trust our intuition and to feel more comfortable in our own convictions, even when others don't agree with us. The next refusal is the refusal to turn away from our practice and our dedication to awakening. This is huge. Whatever your path, whatever your commitment, it's imperative to remain focused on telling the truth about your spiritual health as you evolve over time. And that means dropping an anchor somewhere and using this weight as a balancing tool to right yourself on a regular basis. Saying no to the myriad voices perpetually vying for your attention, distracting you from your central purpose, is critical to conscious living and remaining grounded while also reaching upward and outward beyond our limits. For this to happen, it is imperative that we make our spiritual practice as irresistible and rewarding as possible. And that means creating an original and honest relationship between ourselves and God or spirit or the divine or Buddha mind, whatever it is that you feel drawn to calling this mysterious quality. So we all have to ask ourselves when we're creating a spiritual practice, what kind of person are you? How do you connect to divine awareness most naturally and enjoyably? Do you like group ritual or solo contemplation? Do you like movement or stillness? Are you drawn to traditional forms of prayer or worship or self-created forms of practice that draw from many different sources and styles? Once you answer these questions and decide on a practice that you enjoy, it's wise to stick to what you choose and resist the urge to skip from thing to thing in an effort to avoid your own resistance. So stick with it long enough to know that you're not changing because you're running away from your own resistance, but you're changing because it simply doesn't suit you anymore or as a person that you truly are. And finally, we come to the last item on the list, which is the refusal to deny the presence of God. When we live with sacramental awareness, when we see the divine in the world around us, and we recognize the illumination within ourselves, life is transformed from a flat, repetitive affair to an unfolding act of reverence and gratitude and wonder. Not that everything is suddenly perfect in our lives. We still have our problems, our feelings, our pain, our hard life situations. But instead of viewing our human condition through spoiled, selfish, and childish eyes, and focusing on what we don't have, whining to some imagined parent God who seems to have forgotten us, we remember the fact that we are alive and how unlikely it is that this should be, and how precious it is to have a body and a consciousness with which to experience the world. This recognition snaps us awake from the trance of self-pity. When self-pity lifts, wonder appears. When we refuse to see ourselves as victims, we can finally acknowledge the God within us and step into a new way of being. So I suggest you try experimenting with some or all of these 8 refusals. I think you'll find that they help to cultivate spiritual stubbornness and the ability to stand alone when necessary, which every seeker needs in order to maintain his or her own integrity. So that's what I wanted to say to you today about the gift of spiritual stubbornness. And now, Jay, why don't we open up the lines and we can have some conversation? So I'm very curious, folks, to know about your attitude towards stubbornness. and how you deal with your own obstinacy. Do you tend to judge it, or do you use it in the service of your own awakening, your own unfolding, and your own coming closer to what is true for yourself?